Emmett Sloan expected a whisper. What he got was a thunderstorm in the shape of a woman. He had pictured someone small, someone delicate, with hands made for tending a garden and a voice that would soften the edges of his crushing loneliness. He'd spent months carving that image into his heart, a desperate prayer from a man lost on the vast, silent prairie. But when the dust from the wagon wheels finally settled, the woman standing before him wasn't a prayer answered. She was a challenge, a giant. Willa Blaine stood a full head taller than him, with shoulders that strained the seams of her simple dress, and hands that looked like they could wrestle a bear and win. The letter in his pocket, filled with gentle words and shared hopes, suddenly felt like a lie. The small wedding ring he'd carved from oak, the one that represented all his dreams, now seemed like a child's toy. This couldn't be right. It was all a mistake, a cruel public joke with him as the punchline. 3 months earlier, his hands had trembled as he placed the ad in the newspaper. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. He'd received only one reply. One. A letter written in a surprisingly delicate script. A letter that spoke of a loneliness so profound it felt like an echo of his own. Willa's words had painted a picture of a life he craved. Shared meals, quiet conversations, a partner to face the wilderness with. She had built a home for him in his mind long before she ever set foot on his land. But in all those letters, through all those shared vulnerabilities, she had forgotten one tiny detail. She was a giantess, a titan of a woman who looked like she could snap him in two. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who'd arranged the whole disastrous affair, cleared his throat, the sound like gravel grinding together. His eyes darted between Emmett's pale, stunned face and Willa's imposing frame. She, too, seemed thrown off balance. For the first time, her confident posture wavered as she took in Emmett's slight build. The way he had to crane his neck just to meet her gaze. The whole town had come out to watch. He could feel their eyes on him, their whispers carrying on the wind. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, her face a mask of poorly concealed gossip. Young Tommy Morrison pointing openly before his mother slapped his hand down. Emmett's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it could peel the skin from his bones. This was a nightmare, a public spectacle of his own making. He had advertised for a partner and had instead summoned a force of nature that made him feel smaller and weaker than ever before. Willa finally broke the suffocating silence. Her voice was deeper than he'd imagined, rich and steady, but not unkind. "You must be Emmett." She extended a hand, and when he reluctantly took it, his own was completely swallowed. Her grip was firm, powerful, yet she held his hand with a strange gentleness, as if she were handling a fragile bird, fully aware of her own crushing strength. "I suppose," she said, her eyes holding a flicker of the same doubt that was screaming in his mind, "we should talk." Fletcher Knox, desperate to escape the palpable tension, scrambled to unload her trunk. Just one trunk, but it was massive, a heavy, reinforced footlocker bound with iron straps, far larger than any woman's trunk Emmett had ever seen. It landed on the dusty ground with a solid, heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of his small ranch. As Fletcher scurried away, leaving them alone in the arena of public opinion, Willa surveyed Emmett's modest homestead. He braced himself for the disappointment, for the curl of her lip at the simple cabin, the patched fences, the life he had to offer. But it never came. Instead, she nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on his well-tended vegetable garden, the neat stack of firewood, the small details he took pride in. Whatever shock she felt, she masked it with a grace he hadn't expected. But as she turned her head, he saw it. A long, faded scar that ran from her temple down to her jawline, a silvery track hidden by the angle of her face. The letters had never mentioned a scar, and they definitely hadn't mentioned whatever was locked away in that iron-bound trunk. He had invited a stranger to his home, but he was beginning to suspect he hadn't just invited a woman. He had invited a mystery, and maybe, just maybe, he had invited danger. The next morning, chaos erupted. A sound of splintering wood and furious bellowing ripped Emmett from a restless sleep. His prize bull, Dakota, a 2,000-pound beast with a temper like a cornered rattlesnake, had somehow shattered the reinforced fence of his corral. And now the bull was on a rampage, standing defiantly in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's prized flower garden, systematically destroying years of her hard work. Shouts and screams echoed across the valley. It was the exact nightmare he'd always feared. He was a rancher who couldn't control his own livestock. He stood on his porch, wringing his hands, a spectator to his own humiliation. Two of his neighbors had already tried to approach Dakota, only to be sent scrambling for their lives as the massive animal charged. They now stood at a safe distance, their fear a public testament to his failure. This was it. This was the scandal that would define him for the rest of his life. The small man with the giant bride and the devil bull he couldn't tame. "You can't rope him from here," a calm voice observed from beside him. It was Willa. She'd appeared at his elbow so silently he hadn't even noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the bull, her expression unreadable, analytical. "And those men are going to get themselves killed if they keep approaching him head-on." Emmett just nodded, his throat tight with misery. "He's never been like this." But that was a lie. He'd always known Dakota was more than he could handle. He'd bought him to project an image of strength he didn't possess, and now that lie was being gored and trampled in front of the entire town. Without another word, Willa stepped off the porch. She started walking toward the chaos, her strides long and purposeful. Emmett's mind screamed in protest. "Willa, wait! He's dangerous!" But she didn't slow down. He scrambled to keep up, his short legs pumping. As they got closer, the full extent of the disaster became clear. Roses were shredded, fences were flattened. Mrs. Henderson was on her porch, her face a blotchy red, shrieking accusations at him. "That monster has destroyed everything, Emmett Sloan. You'll pay for this. You have no business keeping animals you can't control." The crowd of neighbors murmured in agreement. Their sympathy was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. Willa ignored all of it. Her focus was entirely on the bull. Dakota was pawing the ground, his massive head low, preparing for another charge. His eyes were wide, rolling with fury and panic. And then Willa did something that made Emmett's blood run cold. She climbed over the broken fence and walked directly into the garden. Alone, unarmed. The crowd gasped, falling silent. Even Mrs. Henderson's tirade choked in her throat. This impossibly tall woman was walking toward a rampaging bull that had sent grown men running for their lives. She was walking to her death. Dakota's head snapped toward her, nostrils flaring. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Emmett wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but he was frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and awe. Willa didn't stop. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, a strange rhythmic melody that was almost a chant. It wasn't a command, it was a conversation. The bull's ears twitched. His pawing slowed. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else. Confusion. "Easy now, big fellow," Willa murmured, extending a hand, palm up. "You're not really angry, are you? Just lost." She took another step, then another. She was now feet away from those lethal horns, but Dakota didn't charge. The tension in his massive body seemed to drain away, replaced by a strange calm. When she was close enough to touch him, she reached out and laid her hand on his neck, scratching gently behind his ear. The effect was instantaneous. The bull sighed, a great gust of air, and leaned into her touch like a giant puppy. The crowd was utterly silent, their faces a perfect picture of disbelief. This wasn't just skill. This was something else entirely, something unnatural. "Someone fetch me a lead rope," Willa called out, her voice calm, authoritative. Fletcher Knox, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, scrambled to obey. Within minutes, Willa had fashioned a halter and was leading the 2,000-pound beast out of the ruined garden as if he were a gentle lamb. As she passed Emmett, she offered him a small, wry smile. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said, her voice casual. "Looks like the wood was sawed halfway through." The words hit Emmett like a physical blow. Sawed through? This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had intentionally set his bull loose. Someone wanted to ruin him. And this strange, giant woman, his mail-order bride, was the only one who had seen it. The story of Willa and the bull spread like a prairie fire. By afternoon, a parade of neighbors found excuses to stop by the ranch, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They watched her as she worked alongside Emmett, repairing the fence he now knew had been sabotaged. She moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, driving fence posts into the hard-baked earth with single powerful swings of a sledgehammer. Each blow echoed with a finality that made Emmett's own efforts seem feeble. The attention became unbearable when Samuel Morrison arrived. Morrison was a man who measured the world in muscle and sweat, and in his eyes, Emmett had always come up short. He leaned against a post, his three strapping sons arranged behind him like a jury. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock," Morrison said, his words dripping with insinuation. He was looking at Willa, but the challenge was aimed squarely at Emmett. The unspoken question hung in the air. What kind of man needs a woman to do his work for him? Emmett felt a familiar heat creep up his neck. "Willa grew up on a cattle ranch," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. It was a detail she'd shared that morning, a simple fact that now felt like a desperate defense. Morrison's eldest son, full of the unearned confidence of youth, stepped forward. "Maybe she'd like some help with that," he offered, gesturing at the heavy post-hole digger. The offer wasn't kind, it was a test, a way to assert his own strength by highlighting her supposed weakness as a woman. Willa paused, wiping sweat from her brow at the back of her hand. Her gaze was cool, direct. "I appreciate the thought," she said, her voice even, "but I've got my rhythm now." The rejection was polite but absolute. The young man's face tightened, his pride stung. He had offered his strength, and this woman, this giantess, had told him she didn't need it. The social order of their small world had been turned upside down, and the Morrisons didn't like it one bit. As they watched her work, Emmett saw the suspicion in their eyes. Her skill wasn't just impressive, it was unnatural. Whispers started to circulate, hushed words he could just barely overhear. Words like witchcraft and unnatural. The taming of the bull wasn't a miracle, it was a dark omen. Her strength wasn't a gift, it was a threat. And then there was the fence, sawed through. It was an act of malice aimed at him. But why? Who in this small, tight-knit community hated him enough to risk unleashing a 2,000-pound bull? His gaze fell on Samuel Morrison, whose land bordered his own, who had always looked at Emmett's modest success with a covetous gleam in his eye. Or was it Mrs. Henderson? Was her public fury a cover for a more calculated act of revenge for some imagined slight? Every friendly face now seemed like a mask, hiding a potential enemy. He was surrounded by threats he couldn't see, and his only ally was a woman who was becoming the subject of the town's darkest fears. That night, she said something that chilled him to the bone. As they sat on the porch in a heavy silence, she stared out into the darkness. "Whoever did it," she said softly, "they're not done." She reached into a small pocket in her dress and pulled out a strange, carved piece of wood, almost like a whistle. She held it tight in her fist. They wanted the bull to hurt someone. When that didn't work, they'll try something else. He realized then that her calmness with the bull wasn't just about skill. It was about familiarity. She had seen this kind of violence before. The scar on her face, the iron-bound trunk, the strange whistle. They were all pieces of a puzzle he was terrified to solve. The gentle woman from the letters was gone, replaced by a hardened stranger with secrets etched into her skin. The silence on the porch that night was thick with unspoken questions. The air crackled with the storm that had been brewing between them since her arrival. Emmett felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He had invited a companion into his life to combat loneliness, but now he felt a new kind of isolation, the kind that comes from sharing a space with a person you don't understand at all. Willa was the one who finally spoke, her voice low and weary. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the prairie met the star-dusted sky. Emmett shifted in his chair, the old wood groaning in protest. I I should have been more specific in my letters." The admission felt hollow, inadequate. What could he have written? Wanted a wife, but please be smaller than me, less capable, so I can feel like a man. It was a thought so shameful he couldn't even voice it. Specific about what? Willa turned to face him, her eyes cutting through the darkness. About your neighbors? About the fact that they measure a man's worth by the size of his shadow? There was no malice in her tone, only a sharp, painful understanding. It was as if she could see right through him, into the very core of his insecurities. About feeling like I'm not enough, he finally whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Not strong enough, not man enough for this life. The confession hung between them, raw and ugly. He expected pity, or maybe even contempt. Instead, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. You know what I saw today? She asked. When that bull was loose, and the whole town was either running scared or shouting accusations. She didn't wait for an answer. I saw a man who didn't run. You stood your ground. You were terrified, I could see it. But you didn't abandon your responsibility. You didn't hide. She leaned forward, her presence suddenly filling the small space. And when I walked into that garden, you were the only one who tried to stop me. Not because you wanted to be a hero, but because you were genuinely afraid for my safety. Your fear wasn't for yourself, it was for me. The idea was so foreign to him. He had only seen his own cowardice in that moment, his own helplessness. He had never considered that she might have seen something else entirely, something that looked like courage. And what I should have written, Willa continued, her voice hardening slightly, was that I'm tired. I'm tired of being a spectacle, tired of men who see me as a challenge to be conquered or a beast to be tamed. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. All day he had been consumed by his own embarrassment, his own feelings of inadequacy. It had never once occurred to him that she might be carrying a burden just as heavy, that her strength, the very thing he envied and feared, was its own kind of prison. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw past the towering height in the broad shoulders. He saw the flicker of exhaustion in her eyes, the faint lines of worry around her mouth. He saw the woman who wrote lonely letters in a delicate script, the woman who had traveled 1,000 miles based on the hope that she might find a place where she didn't have to be strong all the time. But the mystery remained, the sabotage, the scar, the heavy locked trunk. Someone cut that fence, Willa. They wanted to hurt me, to ruin me. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back to the darkness. I know, she said, and I know who it was. Emmett's heart hammered against his ribs. Who? Morrison. No, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Not Morrison. Someone much cleverer. Someone who arranged this whole thing. A cold dread washed over Emmett as the implication of her words settled in. Fletcher Knox, he breathed. But why? Because this is what he does, Willa said, her voice laced with a cold fury. He finds lonely men, isolated ranchers. He promises them companions, gentle women from back east. But he delivers women like me, women who are unexpected, women he knows the ranchers will reject. Then he swoops in, offers to solve the problem, and takes the woman to the next town, collecting a fee at every stop. We're not brides, we're cattle, shuffled from one pen to the next. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the scheme was staggering. Fletcher Knox, the friendly merchant, the man who had seemed so nervous and helpful, was a predator. He sabotaged the fence to force your hand, Willa explained. He expected you to be terrified to send me away. He didn't count on you standing your ground, and he certainly, she added with a grim smile, didn't count on me. The pieces started to click into place, but one thing still didn't make sense. How do you know all this? Willa finally looked at him, and in her eyes he saw a grief so profound it stole his breath. Because my father was one of his first victims. Knox brought a woman to our ranch, a good woman, strong like me. My father, a proud man, was humiliated. He sent her away. Knox ruined him, not with a bull, but with shame. My father lost his spirit, then he lost his ranch, and then he lost his life. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, her back to him. I've been tracking Fletcher Knox for 2 years. I answered your advertisement because I knew it was him. It was my only way to get close. To find the proof I need to stop him." She turned back, her face a mask of iron resolve. "And that proof," she said, gesturing toward her massive iron-bound trunk, "is in there." Emmett stared at the trunk. It sat in the corner of the small cabin like a sleeping beast, a silent testament to the secrets Willa had carried all the way to his doorstep. His mail-order bride wasn't a bride at all. She was a hunter, and he was standing in the middle of her hunting grounds. The world had tilted on its axis. The simple narrative of his lonely life had been ripped apart and rewritten as a tale of vengeance and deception. "Knox knows I'm here," Willa said, her voice pulling him back from the edge. "He knows his plan failed. He's going to get desperate." Her words hung in the air, a prophecy of violence to come. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every creak of the cabin floorboards sounded like an approaching footstep. The quiet ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. "What's in the trunk?" Emmett asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything," she replied. "Ledgers, letters, sworn statements from other women he's trapped. Enough to see him hang." She walked over to the trunk and produced a small, intricate key from a chain around her neck. With a click, the lock sprang open. She lifted the heavy lid, and Emmett peered inside. It wasn't just documents. There was a pistol, well-oiled and gleaming in the lamplight. There was a long, wicked-looking knife, and there were maps, routes, and timetables for every wagon and train line in the territory. This was the arsenal of a woman at war. The realization hit him then. She hadn't just come here to expose Knox. She had come here prepared to end him. The gentle, lonely woman from the letters was a complete fabrication, a mask worn to hide the avenging angel beneath. And he, Emmett Sloan, was her cover. A pawn in a game far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. Suddenly, the shame he'd felt about his size, about his strength, seemed trivial. He was caught in a storm, and his only hope for survival was to trust the thunderstorm that had walked into his life. "He'll come for it," Emmett said, stating the obvious. "He can't let you leave here with that trunk." "I know," Willa said, her hand resting on the grip of the pistol. "I'm counting on it." The night passed in a state of hyper-vigilant tension. They took turns watching the windows, the silence of the prairie no longer a comfort, but a canvas for their fears. Every gust of wind sounded like a boot on the porch, every hoot of an owl like a signal in the dark. In those long, quiet hours, they talked. Not about their mismatched expectations, but about survival. Willa showed him how to load and fire the pistol. Her hands were steady, her movements practiced and efficient. She spoke of Knox's methods, his cruelty, the trail of ruined lives he'd left in his wake. As he listened, Emmett's fear began to curdle into a cold, hard anger. Knox hadn't just insulted his pride, he had violated the sanctity of his home. He had used Emmett's deepest vulnerability, his loneliness, as a weapon against him. This was his land. This was his home. And he would not let some snake in the grass tear it down. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, a new sound reached them. Not the wind, but the slow, deliberate clatter of a wagon. A single wagon moving without lights, its wheels crunching on the gravel of the path leading to his ranch. "He's here," Willa said, her voice flat, devoid of fear. And he didn't come alone. Emmett looked out the small window. In the faint pre-dawn light, he could see the silhouette of the wagon. Fletcher Knox was in the driver's seat, and standing in the wagon bed behind him were two other figures. He recognized them instantly. It was Samuel Morrison's two eldest sons, their shoulders broad and menacing in the dim light. Knox hadn't just come for the trunk. He had turned the community against them. He had twisted the narrative, painting Willa as a dangerous outsider, a witch, and himself as the town's protector. Morrison's sons weren't just muscle. They were a symbol. The town had chosen its side, and it wasn't with them. Willa checked the pistol one last time. "You need to get out of here, Emmett. This is my fight." He looked at her, at the raw determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was fully prepared to die here, to take Knox down with her. He thought about the life he'd had before she arrived. Quiet, safe, and soul-crushingly empty. He thought about the easy way out, about running, hiding, letting her face this alone. But the man she'd seen, the one who hadn't run from the bull, refused to let him. No, he said, his voice steadier than he thought possible. He picked up the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. It felt clumsy and inadequate in his hands. This is my ranch, my home. They're not taking it. Willa looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. For the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, she looked at him not as a problem to be managed or a weakness to be protected, but as an equal, as a partner. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. The wagon ground to a halt in the yard. The fight was here, and they would face it together. Emmett Sloan, Fletcher Knox's voice boomed across the yard, falsely cheerful. We've come to help you with your situation. It was a performance for the Morrison boys, a way to frame the impending violence as a rescue. Willa and Emmett exchanged a look. They knew this wasn't a negotiation. Stay away from the windows, Willa murmured, moving toward the back of the cabin. They'll expect us to be watching the front. Emmett's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but his mind was surprisingly clear. This was his home. He knew every loose floorboard, every blind spot, every shadow. There's a root cellar door under the rug in the pantry, he whispered. It comes out behind the woodpile. We can circle around them. Willa's eyes widened slightly in approval. He wasn't just a pawn. He had a strategy. He was using his knowledge, his intimacy with this small patch of land, as a weapon. They moved silently, lifting the heavy bearskin rug to reveal the trapdoor. The cellar was damp and smelled of earth and potatoes. As they slipped into the darkness, they could hear the heavy thud of boots on the porch, followed by the splintering crash of the front door being kicked in. Check the whole place, Knox shouted from inside. Find the trunk, and the woman. Emmett led the way through the cramped cellar, his hand outstretched in the dark. He found the ladder and pushed open the heavy wooden door at the top. Cool morning air flooded the space. They were outside, shielded from view by the massive stack of firewood he'd spent all summer building. Peering through a gap in the logs, they could see the Morrison boys ransacking the cabin, tossing furniture aside. Knox stood on the porch, his face twisted in a vicious snarl, the friendly merchant mask completely gone. He was furious, cheated of his prize. She's not in there, one of the boys yelled. The trunk's gone too. Knox's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the yard. He was a cornered animal, and that made him unpredictable. They must have run for it, he spat. Spread out. Find them. They couldn't have gotten far. This was their chance. While the Morrison boys headed for the barn, Knox remained on the porch, his back to the woodpile. Willa readied the pistol, but Emmett held up a hand, shaking his head. A gunshot would bring the boys running back instantly. They needed to be smarter. He pointed toward the corral, where Dakota was pacing restlessly, agitated by the commotion. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form in his mind. He looked at Willa and whispered, Can you still calm him? She looked from Emmett to the bull and back again. A slow smile spread across her face. I can do better than that, she said. I can make him angry. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the strange carved whistle he'd seen before. She explained in a hushed voice that it wasn't for calming animals. It was a special tool, carved from a specific type of wood, that emitted a high-frequency pitch that drove herd animals into a frenzy. It was a tool of last resort, a weapon of chaos. While Willa crept toward the far side of the corral, staying low, Emmett moved in the opposite direction. His target wasn't Knox. It was the wagon. With trembling hands, he pulled out his pocket knife and began sawing at the leather straps of the horse's harness. It was a flimsy attack, but it was all he had. Knox, hearing a noise from the corral, turned. What was that? He started walking toward the fence, his eyes trying to pierce the morning shadows. At that exact moment, Willa put the whistle to her lips. A sound, barely audible to human ears, sliced through the air. Dakota's response was immediate and terrifying. The bull let out a roar of pure rage and charge, not at Willa, but at the nearest thing that moved. Fletcher Knox. Knox screamed, a high-pitched shriek of terror, and scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. The bull, instead of goring him, slammed its massive head against the corral fence. Again and again, the wood groaning and splintering under the assault. The Morrison boys came running from the barn, their faces pale with shock. They saw the raging bull, the terrified Knox, and in that moment, the narrative Knox had spun for them fell apart. This wasn't a rescue. This was madness. Emmett chose his moment. As all eyes were on the bull, he darted from his hiding place and finished his work, slicing the final strap of the harness. He slapped the horse's flank hard. The animal, spooked by the noise and the bull's fury, bolted. The wagon lurched forward, careening wildly across the yard directly toward the porch. Knox, scrambling to his feet to escape the bull, turned just in time to see the runaway wagon bearing down on him. He dove to the side, landing in a heap as the wagon smashed into the porch steps with a tremendous crash of splintering wood. The distraction was all Willa needed. She vaulted over the fence and charged, not at Knox, but at the Morrison boys. She didn't attack them. She simply ran toward them, a giantess moving with the speed and purpose of an avalanche. They froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of this unstoppable force of nature. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. It was over. Knox was trapped between a raging bull and a ruined porch. His hired help had abandoned him, and Emmett was standing there, a simple rancher, holding nothing more than a small pocket knife, having orchestrated the entire beautiful disaster. He had used his mind, his knowledge of his own land, and he had won. Strength, he realized, came in more forms than he had ever imagined. In the aftermath, as the dust settled, Samuel Morrison himself rode up, drawn by the commotion. He saw his sons, disarmed and humbled. He saw Fletcher Knox, a pathetic figure covered in dirt, being tied up by Emmett with rope from the barn. And he saw Willa standing calmly beside the corral, whispering to the bull, whose rage was already subsiding into a low, rumbling complaint. The Morrison boys, ashamed, confessed everything. Knox had fed them lies about Willa being a thief and a witch, preying on their fear of the unknown. He had promised them a share of the money he claimed she had stolen. Seeing the truth, that Willa and Emmett were the victims, changed everything. The community that had been so quick to judge was now just as quick to offer its support. By the time the sheriff arrived, Fletcher Knox's reign of terror was over. The trunk and its contents provided all the proof needed to ensure he would never harm anyone again. That evening, the silence on the porch was different. It wasn't heavy with doubt or fear. It was filled with a quiet, profound sense of peace. They had faced the storm together and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. "I guess this wasn't what either of us expected," Emmett said, echoing Willa's words from the night before. This time it wasn't a lament. It was a statement of fact, tinged with wonder. Willa turned to him, her face soft in the twilight. "No," she said. "It was better." He had spent so long dreaming of a quiet life, a simple partnership, but the life he had now, forged in chaos and danger, felt more real, more vital than anything he could have imagined. He realized he didn't need a woman to make him feel bigger. He needed a partner who saw the strength that was already there. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the small wooden box. His hands were steady now. Inside, the oak ring seemed to glow in the fading light. It was still simple, still unadorned, but it was no longer a symbol of his mismatched hopes. It was a symbol of his resilience. "I had planned to do this properly," he said, his voice clear and sure. "To wait until we had talked, until I was sure you weren't disappointed." He gestured around him, at the modest ranch, at himself. "By all this." Willa stepped closer. She took the box from him and lifted the ring, turning it over in her large, capable hands. "You made this yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. "How long did it take?" As she spoke, she tried to slip it onto her finger. Just as he'd feared, it was too small. It stopped at her second knuckle, a perfect, beautiful failure. 3 months, Emmett admitted, but the sinking feeling in his heart was gone, replaced by something else. "I started it the day I got your first letter." Willa looked from the ring on her knuckle to his face, and she smiled. A genuine, breathtaking smile that lit up her entire being. 3 months, she repeated softly. "You spent 3 months making something for a woman you'd never met, based on nothing but letters and hope." She slipped the ring off and held it in her palm. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She placed the ring back into his hand and closed his fingers around it. Ask me properly, Emmett, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Not because of an arrangement, but because you want to. He looked up into her face, and for the first time, he saw everything. Not just her height or her strength, but the intelligence, the kindness, the fierce loyalty, the lonely woman who wrote letters, and the avenging warrior who fought for justice. He saw his partner. Willa Blaine, he said, his voice ringing with a certainty that came from the very core of his soul. Will you marry me? Not because of letters or what anyone expects, but because I think we can build something incredible together, something neither of us could ever build alone. Yes, she said, the single word of promise that settled over the quiet ranch. Yes, but I have one condition. She took his hand, the one holding the ring. I want us to resize this ring together. I want you to teach me how to work with wood. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. And in return, I'll teach you how to properly fence a corral so your prize bull doesn't go visiting the neighbors again. 6 months later, they stood before the whole town and were married. The wooden ring, now a perfect fit, sat on her finger. Their ranch was thriving, a testament to their unconventional partnership. The whispers about the strange, giant woman had long since faded, replaced by stories of her courage and Emmett's quiet, unshakable resolve. They had found in each other not what they thought they wanted, but what they truly needed. Not a person to fill the empty spaces, but a partner to stand beside, strong in their own unique ways, facing the vast, wild frontier together. They were a whisper and a thunderstorm, and together they were magnificent. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected love and hidden strength, you won't want to miss the next one. Click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the wild frontier. And please, if these stories mean something to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us keep the campfire burning and the stories coming. Thank you for watching.